Welcome to Cambridge Forum, discussing Why I Read with author and essayist Wendy Lesser, in conversation with poet Robert Pinsky. Her latest book is Why I Read, The Serious Pleasure of Books. In it, she explores the way that literature, especially poetry, touches readers and changes their lives. In a culture that is increasingly visual and virtual in orientation, what role does old-fashioned reading play? What power does the written word have in our lives? Why should we read? These are some of the questions that she will address in conversation with Robert Pinsky.
I thought I would talk a little, first of all, about what the book is about and how it's structured and so forth, and then read a little bit from it to give you the flavor of it, and then Robert and I will talk. What I won't be doing, probably, is answering the questions that Pat raised in her last couple of sentences, because those were not actually what I was thinking of doing when I was writing the book. It's called Why I Read for a reason. It will not answer the question of why we read or why one should read. Should is as far away from this book as it can get. I've pushed it away. I don't want should to be involved with reading. I guess if there's a phrase that is indicative of the attitude I take toward reading, it's in the subtitle. The subtitle is The Serious Pleasure of Books. And serious pleasure is important to why I read. And I know it's important to Robert, too. I mean, the notion of pleasure and serious pleasure comes up again and again in his criticism and his poetry, so I think we'll have a lot to talk about on that front. So I set out to write this book, having written 9 other books, and thinking, well, I want my 10th book to be something I really know about, not Shostakovich and his 15 quartets, which I had to work really hard to write. That was the one before, because I am not a musician and I'm not a music critic, and it was terribly hard for me to write that book. And so I thought, the whole time I was writing it, I thought, the next book's going to be about literature, my first love, the thing I know, the thing I spend hours a day doing for fun. And I had, before I set out even to write the book, I had a number of ideas about what the chapters would be. I knew I wanted it to be a book, not just separate essays about different works of literature. And I knew that I wanted the chapters to be on general subjects, and some of the current chapter titles like authority, grandeur and intimacy, character and plot, although that was a little different, but I'll tell you how it changed elsewhere. These were all notions that were in my mind and I thought would come out as chapters. But the main thing about writing is rewriting. So you get the thing down on the page and then you discover that you didn't do it quite right. And that was a lot of the part of the process of writing this book. And when I set out to write the book, the first 2 or 3 drafts had 2 chapters at the front after the Why I Read introduction, and they went character and then plot. Those were 2 separate chapters. Even though I said in both of them that character and plot are inextricably linked and you can't possibly understand one without the other and blah, 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 nonetheless, I separated them into these 2 chapters. And then the way I write is I finished writing what I think is a good enough draft and I show it to some friends. So I showed this draft around to about 4 friends, and they're all thanked in the acknowledgments at the end. One of them, Thomas Wong, who's thanked at the end, who is not a literary person by profession at all. He was an investment banker until he escaped from that evil activity, and now he collects art, and he reads for pleasure, only for pleasure. He has never read professionally or written about literature or anything. And he read the book and he said, well, the problem I had with the first 2 chapters was I would be reading along happily about something you were saying about novels and characters in novels and plots in novels, and then all of a sudden there would be all this stuff about poetry and about the writer's voice and the writer's relationship to the reader, and it would stop me and confuse me, and I didn't understand what was going on, but I would plow through it, and then we would get back to the nice part about plot and character, and I would be back on firm ground with the novel. So I thought, okay, he's telling me something. I mean, I'm going to hear it in a slightly different way, which is, it's not junk, the parts about poetry and relationship of writer and reader, but they belong somewhere else. And so I went into those 2 chapters, character and plot, and I airlifted out the parts that were all about that voice that speaks to you in poetry, but it also speaks to you in nonfiction and sometimes in fiction, and about our, as readers, our relationship to that voice, sort of the you and I of reading. And that included a lot of other kinds of you and I's, like the author and his character, or the living person and the dead people he's reflecting back on it as he writes. And those all seem to belong together, and I plucked all those parts out as if they had meant to be together, and they made one chapter by themselves. And then I let the rest of character and plot flow together, which it did quite naturally. You know, I had to do a little sewing at the seams to make it look seamless, and I had to write a first and a last paragraph for the new chapter to make it fit the structure that I have in the rest of the book, which I've described in the book as being like a circle of circus elephants, each holding in its prehensile trunk the tail of the elephant in front of it. That is, you get to the end of the chapter and you have a little link, in a way, to the next chapter, and it's a circle, and it all means to come together. So I was quite pleased when this second little chapter came out this way, and I gave it the title, The Space Between. And that's the chapter that I'm going to read to you from tonight. So what I'll give you is the beginning and the end of that chapter. And then you'll get a sense of the tone of the book, and also the way in which these little elephant trunk and tail linkages work. So I've just finished the chapter on character and plot, or you have if you're reading it. And it ends with a discussion of a Portuguese novel called The Maias, which I highly recommend to you, a 19th century novel by Eça de Queiroz that's really a terrific novel. And I talk about the way in which that novel fulfills expectations but also evades them. And I say, we turn to literature to remedy the loss, that is, the loss of the fact that life doesn't have obvious meaning and structure, to impose some kind of meaningful order on the non-sequential. And good literature, like the Maias, meets us only halfway. Okay, so there's already in that sentence a suggestion of a gap, and then the next chapter title is The Space Between. There will always be a gap of some kind. It may be located in places as small as the sentence or even the individual word. It may govern entire relationships among characters, between character and author, between author and reader. It may be a purely metaphorical absence, or it may involve an actual cut or deletion, but it is always there. Sometimes the severance, the gap, is built into the authorial strategy itself. Dickens is a master of this. His most memorable characters seem to possess detachable parts, salient characteristics, which in taking on a life of their own, come eventually to represent the whole personality. The less realistic these humorously exaggerated characters are, the more they are prone to demonstrating a single representative quality that exists apart from themselves. Yet in some ways, these distinctive habits, always practiced to excess, are the most realistic things about these people, for it is precisely in their notable excrescences that we are likely to recognize ourselves. Hardly a year ever passes, for instance, without my recalling Mr. Dick, the pleasant, loony gentleman in David Copperfield, who is sane on every subject save that of King Charles's head. Unfortunately, he simply can't keep his mind off this beheaded monarch's gruesome appendage. It will keep popping into his awareness and into his voluminous writings, despite his best efforts to keep it out. You would be surprised how many people suffer from their own variety of King Charles's head. I am always surprised when I see my versions of it, and I have a number of them, popping up and ruining my pages. Detachability is the key element here, not only for Dickens's metaphor, but for literary practice in general. It is the space left in between, the gap between Charles's imagined body and his severed head, the sliver of reality separating me from Mr. Dick, that thrives intensely and perhaps singularly in literary works. Sometimes the gap is imposed from the outside by a force even stronger and more uncontrollable than the writer's own obsessions. One of the strangest aspects of Dostoevsky's Demons, which is a novel I talk about earlier in the book, and it also goes under the name The Possessed. If you wonder, what's this Demons? It's The Possessed, is the fact that its most powerful and seemingly necessary episode, the chapter in which Stavrogan confesses to the crime that underlies all his behavior, the long-ago rape of a young girl who subsequently committed suicide, that chapter was cut by the censorious editors before the book's publication. That crucial chapter, which Dostoevsky repeatedly fought to keep in, but with no success, disappeared from Demons for the rest of the author's life and for many decades after. Even now, it survives only as an appendix in most editions. How could the novel have existed without it? How could anyone have begun to understand demons or respond properly to it without this essential key? And yet people did. Literature is a remarkable thing, and so are its readers. Together they managed to triumph over even the most severe amputations or decapitations. Poetry, as it turns out, works largely through severances of this kind. In a poem, the kind of connection that is usually essential to our understanding of what is happening has been purposely removed. A bridge that normally leads between two precipices has been chopped away, and we are left trying to jump across on our own. Character and plot, the two elements that in the novel help us locate ourselves, are more shadowy, less evident in poetry, becoming transformed at times into just the sound of a voice or the remembrance of an event. And yet they are still there, even in the briefest of poems. They are part of what enables us to leap over those chasms. Consider the opening lines of one of Gerard Manley Hopkins's most wrenching sonnets. No worst, there is none. Pitched past pitch of grief, more pangs will, schooled at 4 pangs wilder ring. Comforter, where is your comforting? Mary, mother of us, where is your relief? We ourselves are pitched immediately into a profound emotional darkness, the superlative version of a non-existent negative, with that strange extreme phrase, no worst, there is none. Yet even here, in this state of complete abandonment, we are somehow held, enclosed, located in a feeling, if not in a precise place. And that, I think, is because we can sense the presence of the characters and the relationship between them, the idiosyncratic, pain-racked speaker and those absent others, comforter, Mary, to whom he pleadingly, uselessly speaks. The poem in its very language reenacts and alludes to the procedure by which it operates, that leap across an unbridged chasm which the poet is now requiring of us, just as his God is apparently requiring it in a much more painful fashion of him. The sonnet ends with the lines, "Oh, the mind has mountains, cliffs of fall, frightful, sheer, no man fathomed. Hold them cheap, may who ne'er hung there. Nor does long our small durance deal with that steep or deep. Here, Creepwretch, under comfort serves in a whirlwind. All life death does end, and each day dies with sleep." What has been cut out is not just the connective words, a comfort that serves in a whirlwind, may those who never hung there, or even letters, so that the arcanely poetic ne'er here has a radical, rejuvenated, bridge chopped off function. The fulcrum of it all, the platform from which speech emerges, has itself been eliminated. That steep or deep what? Where in all this nothingness can one locate that exclamatory here? Yet despite the radical excisions, the voice is stronger than ever. Its rhymes are insistent to the point of comedy, though certainly no one is laughing here, and there is a tenderness in that appositive command, Creepwretch, under a comfort, that brings a distinctly human note to this otherwise stark landscape. This is a voice that is continuing to speak even though no one is listening, and one senses that the person being addressed has changed by the end of the sonnet. No longer God or Mary, the presumed listener is now that wretch who can only find comfort in the thought of death. Hopkins may be speaking of himself here, must be speaking of himself, or we wouldn't feel so much agony emanating from the poem. But the poor abandoned creature he is addressing is also his reader. This is our problem too, even if we don't know it yet. We are the other character brought to life by such a poem. So that's the beginning, and now I'll skip to the end, where I'm talking about death. And I'll just read a couple paragraphs, and I'll tell you what takes place between the two paragraphs. Death may lower the final curtain on life, but it does not necessarily have the same effect in literature. This is yet another version of the space between, that liminal space which in literature alone marks the uncertain borderline between the dead and the living. I should say, since we're in a church, I'm not a religious person. Since you're only hearing these parts of the book, you might think I am, but these writers, Gerard Manley Hopkins, Dostoevsky, the people I read here, enable me to have some access to belief in a spiritual sense, but it's only through my agnostic little self, not through some prior sense of belief. Okay, back to what I was saying. Marks the uncertain borderline between the dead and the living. Unlike the people who surround us in our daily existence, the characters in a literary work can continue to speak their minds to us from beyond the grave. We may imagine that we can similarly hear from our own beloved dead in dreams or hallucinations or simple remembrances, but these are our minds speaking to us, not theirs. A literary character can be both dead and conscious, both dead and perceptive, both dead and reflective. A dead author can be this too, but not quite in the same way. Reading Henry James, who died 36 years before I was born, only 36, I'm amazed to realize, given that I once considered it another era, but he and I are growing closer and closer as I grow older and he stands still. I hear a voice that continues to speak its mind to me, making jokes I still find funny and psychological observations I still assent to. But even I, besotted as I am with this author, understand that he wrote those sentences as a living person, basically the same kind of living person that I am now. Whereas for those of his characters who incline toward the supernatural, the narrator of The Jolly Corner who returns to his long-ago home and meets his alternate self, the famous author in the private life who carries on an active social life while his double sits writing in the upstairs study, the governess in The Turn of the Screw who imagines her charges have been invaded by morally evil ghosts, the border between life and afterlife is much more permeable. So then I talk about how James does that, but also how Javier Marias, a contemporary Spanish writer, does it, how he writes Marias much more than James from the point of view of the dead, the ghosts, and ghosts are very important in Marias's work. And I talk about Emily Dickinson. If you've read even one Emily Dickinson poem, you probably have a sense of how she projects the voice of the dead. The one I choose is I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died. I write about Tom Gunn. I'm going to read that part to you because Robert and I both knew Tom, and I want to hear his voice here. But before I do, I'll just say the one other thing that you're not hearing is, to go with Emily Dickinson's Fly, I bring in J.R. Ackerley's Fly. J.R. Ackerley wrote a nonfiction book called My Father and Myself, a truly wonderful book. And in it, he talks about his mother as she was growing old, made friends with a particular fly, which he never met, but it had large eyes, beautiful this and that. In other words, he takes his mother's assertion that this fly sat on the edge of her bathtub and ate crumbs every morning as real. And you know, was the fly real or not? Who knows? Was Emily Dickinson's that she heard when she died, that she wrote before she died, real? You know, in literature, it's all blurred. So now I'll read just a little bit about Tom and then the last paragraph. Javier Marias is still very much alive, but something additional happens to such ghost-ridden works when their author himself dies. I used to listen to Tom Gunn read aloud his poem Death's Door, in which he imagined how, after their processing, the dead sit down in groups and watch TV, in which they must be interested, for on it they see you and me. Something of Tom's endearing wit steadily infused this dark poem, in which he imagined 4 of his friends, strangers in life but dead in the same month, watching the black and white set together and gradually losing interest until snow blurs the picture and they are weaned from memory, loosed into the timelessness of the archaic dead. And I can still hear Tom's wit when I reread this poem to myself, but the voice in which it was conveyed is fading now, for he too has joined the dead and been swallowed up in that snow. Okay, then we go through Emily Dickinson and Ackerley, and now the last paragraph. The uncanny in literature is not a separate place, reserved for those who believe in the occult or the supernatural. It is there in every poem that joins us to an absent speaker, every novel that sets up a parallel between our world and its world, every essay that calls to us from the distant era of a now-dead author. That eerily bridgeable gap between the you and the me of a literary work is also a space between the living and the dead, the imagined and the real, the singular and the collective. Even the very word space is doing double duty here, for it points to something that is both there and not there. It is the placeholder that joins us in a sequence, like the single space between each of these words. If you were reading on the page, you would see it. You don't so much hear it as I'm reading it to you. And it is the severance, the emptiness, that keeps us apart. Like all such ambiguous connectors, it is invisible to the casual glance, but we would know instantly if it were to disappear, for in that case, the sentence, the stanza, the entire literary structure would disintegrate on the spot. So that's the end of that chapter, and then the next chapter is called Novelty. In other words, suggesting the way in which taking spaces out removing things that should be in is a way of creating literary novelty, but you'll have to read the book to find out what happens there. Difficult hair moments. In order to put on this microphone, I have to ask the assistance of the sound engineer because it involves getting it under my ponytail. Okay, yeah, do whatever you need to. Okay. All right, we're set.
Okay, I'll start the conversation by agreeing that the book is resolutely personal, and it's resolutely respectful of the subjectivity of reading. Early on in the book, Wendy reveals that she really likes to read the traditional book with paper. Certain kind of reading, she needs the book. And she's married to someone who refuses to ever read anything on paper. If it's a mystery novel she recommends and the paperback is sitting there, he immediately spends the $9.99 to get it onto the electronic form. Doesn't want any of that. And there's a wonderful dialogue in the Apple store between the author, Wendy Lesser, and the young woman in the Apple store. They're enumerating the things Wendy might do with her iPad, listen to music, maybe listen to music while reading, etc. And the young woman says, well, I actually don't, I like books, I always listen to audiobooks. I find if I'm reading a book, I'll look at a sentence and I'll have to look at it again and figure out what it means. And Wendy says to that child, that's what reading is. Maybe in your imagination. Since it is so respectful of subjectivities, I found myself asking, what is the implicit universal? What are you saying about reading that really is universal? And it's interesting that she did choose the chapter, The Space Between, because I would say it's there in your delight in Sancho Panza's joke, in the second installment of Quixote, after the book has become very, very, very famous, and the character starts asking Sancho Panza, what happened in that first telling of the book where you have an ass you're riding, and then it disappears, it's not there anymore, then it comes back. And Sancho Panza says, this is very confusing, I don't know how to do it. Maybe it's a mistake by the author, maybe it's the printer. And that mixing of two realities, the enduring reality, the enduring but impalpable reality of Sancho Panza, of the Karamazov brothers, of the characters in The Golden Ball, that reality, we experience it simultaneously with the temporary reality of our own life. And in this book, you're so it's like everybody has their own way of eating and their own way to eat, on paper, not on paper. It's as much based on taste and personal, it's as intimate, to use one of your words. But I was shocked on somewhere in the middle of the book, you faint towards saying, but of course the author must not ever address us or look like he's a magician who gives away a secret, and then you find yourself saying, oh, whoops, I guess there are times when he does.
Even saying that made me think of all the examples to the contrary.
Yeah. And I guess I accuse you or suggest to you that what you discover, certainly what I discovered in reading the book, is that the pleasure in reading is a pleasure of trembling or oscillating between two kinds of reality.
Right, between knowing that you are yourself sitting there in 2014 at the moment and reading something else, and you cannot escape from yourself, and quite the opposite, escaping from yourself, which is what you do when you're reading. And they're
Yeah.
both going on at the same time. They're not alternating in a way. They are both simultaneous all
That's
along.
what the pleasure is.
Yeah.
I mean, there's one scene in which there's a woman at a dinner party, and she says, "I'm sorry, I have to leave, I have to finish my novel that I'm reading."
The Mayas. She had to get home to read the Mayas.
That Portuguese novel. And you have to think that part of that's a pleasurable, it's like the pleasure of being thirsty and then drinking.
Right.
And there she's sort of both defying the party with it and sharing it. I'll relate that to something you said when you were talking about Tom's wonderful poem where he says, after the processing, so that the process of the afterlife becomes bureaucratic and kind of posting there after the processing. You talked about Tom's very characteristic voice fading. And I thought of this when I read the passage on the Hopkins, when you were talking about Hopkins. Other times you talk about poetry. It is a more vocal art than the novel. It goes back, I've been told that subvocal reading had to be invented. It was invented so that monks in monasteries wouldn't distract one another. And silent reading was a weird thing that had to be discovered. What about the voice? Is it not part of reading a poem that you imagine saying these words? What would it feel like to say, no worse there is none?
I think because I am not a poet and you are, you automatically hear the voice, perhaps your own, I don't know whose, reading those lines as you read them. I don't. I'm not a purely visual critic. That is, who we could name them disdainfully if we wanted, but there are critics, I think from reading their criticism, who read words on the page of poetry as if they were just marks in a painting, essentially, and then that are meant to be taken apart by their visual relationship to each other in some way, or perhaps by the visual notions that they evoke. Obviously, sound is essential to poetry, but because I'm not a poet, I first read for, I'd have to say meaning, it sounds stupid, but so that I had to practice those Hopkins lines before I came out tonight, because otherwise I would stumble over them. I mean, you know, if you've read Hopkins, you know that the lines are very dense and that you're meant to stumble over them. The words clash against each other, and so I had to practice not stammering as I said the lines.
Yeah, I guess I'm suggesting there's another space between and another two kinds of reality at once. When you read the Dickinson poem or the Gunn poem or the Hopkins poem, I think not just if you're a poet, you're partly hearing the poem having a voice all of its own, and it's partly your own voice. Even if it's subvocal reading, you're...
Again, I don't think that's true of me, but as you say, I'm a very subjective reader, and I only have my own way of doing it, but I have never liked the sound of my recorded voice. I'm told it works fine on the radio and so forth. It's not a problematic voice, but I don't like hearing it. And so part of the taking out of oneself that I get by reading to myself is that is not my voice that is saying those lines. That is some disembodied whisper that isn't even as vocalized as a voice, but a means of communicating to me with language. I can hear the jokes. So to hear a joke, you have to hear the pauses and the waiting and everything else that commas do for you. But I don't hear a particular person's voice. And I always find it shocking, for instance, to hear a poet's voice recorded. I almost died when I heard Randall Jarrell's voice recorded the first time, or T.S. Eliot, any of the people that are on records. They don't sound the way the words on the page do to me.
Williams bothers people.
Yeah.
By the way, this aside, that experience of not liking your own recorded voice is almost universal. Always, and I've heard a physiological explanation for it.
That sounds different.
When you hear your own voice, the bones in your head are like a woofer. The bones in your head are amplifying the lows. So when you hear your own voice being recorded, it sounds a little higher and a little bit less because you're not getting the blows that you got from the bones in your head.
I don't have that. It's not that. On the inside, I sound just like me, but when I hear my voice recorded, I sound like my mother.
As they say,
Or all my female relatives for the last, 300 years back.
the only response to that is,
I want to get back to that notion of universality, because I do think that's important. That is, when I was a graduate student in literature, it was the period when theory was coming in. I don't know if any of you brushed with this, but it was, Derrida and deconstruction and all that. And it was all about the reader making the text. The poor author had died. I mean, not in the way that I have him, but he's just gone forever. He doesn't exist anymore, and the reader makes the text over and over, a different text every time. And even as a person in my 20s, I deeply objected to this notion. But I've gotten over it because I realize it doesn't matter. In other words, yes, we all come and we all put our own imprint on the novel that we're reading, and we all have our slightly different Shakespeare that we get out of it, and we change it a little bit to make it acceptable to ourselves or understandable to ourselves. And at different ages, we understand it differently, even the same person. But the original thing's still there, exactly the way it was. And it's going to meet the next generation and the next century, and I hope the next millennium, in exactly the form it was in. And that's the continuity, that we're all being given the same experience by the work of literature, but we're taking out of it something different, which is what we have to do.
yeah, every generation translates it, in effect, into the spiritual and social tongue of that generation. This reminds me that we first met when Wendy was a graduate student at Berkeley and I was a professor. The book is probably less like the way literature is taught and professed in universities and colleges, even than it was then, though theory has faded as a dominant thing.
It's died like the author.
This, I mean, I suppose the scornful word would be belletristic. For me, it would be real. This focusing on the pleasure of reading appears to me to have less and less place in the curriculum. And I don't know if the piece I read by Heather McDonald in the Wall Street Journal is exaggerated or not. She says that UCLA has, the young English professors have revolted against the idea of requiring a course in Shakespeare, a course in Milton, Shakespeare. The English major now, you're required to take a course in ethnic studies, a course in gender studies, I think disabled studies may be in there, and creative writing. And you must take in 3 of those categories. So it's possible to graduate as an English major and not have read Shakespeare.
Right, but in a way, that has nothing to do with the issue of pleasure. That is, these young professors probably think it's more pleasurable to read something about gender studies.
In practice, I think it does have to do with pleasure. It's related to the fact she quotes the local Professor Homi Bhabha of Harvard. She quotes Homi as saying that he's distressed that 57% of the students entering Harvard, 57% said they're interested in majoring in the humanities, and far, far fewer actually do. And McDonald suggests that if you just read the prose written by the professors,
it would scare you away from the humanities.
You can see why the kids say, I guess I'll manage computer science after all.
It's partly that. It's partly their parents saying, how are you going to get a job with an English degree?
Parents always said that. Yeah. And a lot of people used to major in the humanities. So her proposition is that, in fact, the humanities are thriving, doing very, very well, except not in the university. Mm-hmm. That is, online courses, sales of books, all of that. It's not that Shakespeare's in trouble at all. He's just, at the moment, not promulgated in the university.
He's doing very well in New York, as today's New York Times shows. He's being performed all over. Yeah. I mean, the book is meant to be very unacademic. And unlike with the Shostakovich book, where I had to speak in the language of the ordinary person about music, because I don't know any other way to speak about music, but what little I read of what they call analysis in music graduate school, you don't want to hear that. I mean, believe me, it kills the music dead on the page to do that to it. So I was trying to evoke, in the Shostakovich book, the sound of string quartets with words, and that was difficult. But it was, in some ways, just as difficult to pry myself away from years of graduate school training, only I didn't have to do it all at once. I've done it over the decades that have elapsed since I got my PhD. I have gradually and very self-consciously worked my way away from that way of looking at literature because it was divorced from pleasure. And I think the reason is that professors are anxious about asserting their own opinion. They want there to be some kind of written authority that they can stick to, and that is not about pleasure. That is about obeying the laws and acceding to the disciplinary, requirements of your department. And if you approach literature with the idea that it's about pleasure, you have to make a personal judgment every time. Am I having a good time?
In that sense, it's quite stringent.
It is, but it's not unpleasant. Because the minute you're not having a good time, the minute you get bored, you can throw the book down. Now, you will lose some things that way. I lost Oblomov, the great novel by Goncharov. I lost it for 30 years because I threw it down when I was in my 20s. It was boring at the beginning. He wouldn't get out of bed. Okay, I took it up, and it took 100 pages for him to get out of bed, but there was a big payoff after that. So, but there's no ultimate loss. If I died without ever reading Oblomov, I would have been reading something else instead. There's no final exam in this situation. There's no ultimate accounting. Did you read enough? Have you accomplished all the books you meant to get under your belt? I mean, where's the payoff going to be if you do that? Some people reread the same books over and over. My sister rereads Jane Austen every 5 years, the complete Jane Austen. That's as good a way as reading something new all the time.
Maybe you could run through, soon we should invite audience questions, maybe you could run through a very adept thing you do, I'm not sure I could paraphrase, about quality, good, less good, hierarchy, serious. There are a lot of very attractive passages in the book about Henning Mankell.
Yeah. You guys know him, the mystery writer who created Kurt Wallander? I disown the Kenneth Branagh Kurt Wallander. I don't like the TV one, but I mean the one on the page.
Yeah, but also the couple, the Wallu and
Mai Shawal and Per Wallu. There's a lot in here about mysteries.
There's a lot of writing about. You do it a couple of times. You say, now writing is not. The pleasure of reading is not hierarchical. There aren't top tens. You don't rank things, but you do imply there are kinds of good.
Right. So what I say is, literary quality is not hierarchical in the sense that there are types of books that have it, all the good ones at the top that you're made to read in school, and types of books that don't at the bottom, the trash stuff we read for fun, like mysteries and science fiction. And I don't know what other genres people are interested in, but all those things. Now, what I say instead is there are good and bad books in each one of these categories. There are good poems that were written in the 19th century, and there are terrible poems that were written in the 19th century. There are good mysteries, and there are terrible mysteries. There are good bestsellers every once in a while, and there are lots of terrible bestsellers. In other words, you can't think of a category that doesn't have good and bad, and it's up to us to make the judgments about them. There are no safe categories. There are no unsafe, forbidden categories. But I do say toward the end, when I'm talking about Isaac Asimov, and I talk about how he essentially writes the same book over and over every time, I say, so does Henry James. And as in a Henry James novel, the plot goes like this, because there are sort of parallels to the way they construct their notion of the alien figure within a strange culture trying to negotiate against the more powerful, etc. Okay, I finished that sentence, and as with that example you gave where I made an assertion and then caught myself up, I say, okay, for those of you out there ready to have an argument, I am not saying that Isaac Asimov is as good as Henry James. That would be a ridiculous thing to say. But we don't run our lives, and this is where Robert got the top 10, we don't run our lives with the top 10 list or this is better, that is worse. We can't always be reading the best. If we were always reading the best, I would read nothing but The Golden Bowl. I would get to the end of it, I would start at the beginning, and I would read it again, over and over. I would never read anything else. But that's not a way to live a life. You want to read all sorts of things, some of which might be, in a hierarchy sense, better than others, but all of which are good in their own ways. That's essentially the kind of judgment I'm making in the book, I think. Mm-hmm. It's meant, as you can guess, to counteract any assertions that literature should be studied for the following reasons. Should make you a better person. Should make you the kind of person that never puts down a book but finishes it every time. I hate all those shoulds that are associated with books. I think the whole idea is to immerse yourself pleasurably. But I wanted to get back to this serious pleasure idea. I do think it's important to hold on to your brain while you're doing this. You know, you're not just eating candy. I mean, John Stuart Mill, when he was responding to Bentham's Greatest Happiness of the Greatest Number, said, pushpin is not the same as poetry. I have never figured out what pushpin is, but it was some kind of game they played, like Skittles or, you know, checkers or something on a board, or maybe it was more like pool with sticks. But in any case, it was some game. Think of video games. It's like saying video games are not the same as poetry. The pleasure you get from this thing that you kill time with is not the same as the pleasure you get from literature. And that's what I meant by serious pleasure.
Is it maybe time for questions from the audience?
And we would really, really love to hear from you. So we're going to make everybody sit in uncomfortable silence for a couple minutes if you don't come up and say something.
I will ask a question, and I did use the word should in my introduction. And
you will be punished for that.
you have shot that word down several times. But I didn't mean that you were proposing prescriptions. You were writing, you know, read 2 books before morning and call me if your head still aches, that kind of thing. I meant that people can find serious pleasure, as you say, in books. And you have written a whole book about the serious pleasure you find. We could all find some different serious pleasure if we took the time to articulate it. And that kind of, that individual should is the should that I was referring to, my own internal should for reading. The purpose of the Cambridge Forum series is to explore what rubbing shoulders with art does to change your perspective, change your life. How has rubbing shoulders with literature made you who you are today, Wendy Lesser?
Well, first, if I can expand that to say rubbing shoulders with art, because I go to a lot of music and dance performances. I go to a lot of movies. I try and experience as much. I go to museums and look at paintings and galleries. I try and experience art as much as I can. And I do it because it gives me pleasure. That's the main thing. I've managed to turn it into a profession by running the 3-penny Review. So cleverly, sneakily, I managed to make this thing that gives me pleasure be my way of making a living. And that is very lucky. So that's one thing it's turned me into. It's turned me into the editor of the 3-penny Review with all these different hats, getting to, you know, write about music one time and visual art the next and literature the next. But I think because I've been reading longer than I've been doing any of those other things, well, I probably had dance classes when I was 5, so yeah, I've been doing them, but I've been reading more than I've been doing any other thing, and reading sticks with me more, and I understand reading better in part because I'm a writer and I'm not any of those other art forms. A huge portion of my memory and imagination is made up of the things I've read. I mean, I never, I think, go through a day, and I rarely go through a long sequence of hours without comparing something I see or think to a line I've read in a novel or a poem or an essay. And that's just involuntary. I mean, my brain is made up of lots of other people who have existed and had ideas, and they come flooding in and out of my life. And that is very rich. I mean, it means I'm not stuck there by myself ever. I have all these other strands feeding into me all the time, and all these other ways of looking at something that enrich the thing I'm looking at the moment. I mean, just to give you a funny example, the book I'm going to write next is about an architect, Louis Kahn. So last weekend I went to the Kimball Museum in Fort Worth. And I went to it in the daytime and I went to it at night. And the difference in the quality of the light as it comes through this incredibly miraculous ceiling he made so that you can see paintings in real natural light as well as artificial light. The difference between that and the nighttime version, which is like a normal museum, a very nice, beautiful normal museum, but just a normal museum. So in my mind, I said to myself, I jotted down that it's the difference between, and I had two analogies of things that have come to me in the last 40 years of my life. Going to King's College Chapel at Evensong and hearing the male choir sing, the grown-up male choir sing the songs by itself, and going the next night and hearing the little boy sopranos added in. In other words, the difference between night and day, you thought you were getting everything you could just hearing the male sing, grown-up male singers sing, and then these little high voices get added in, and it's like the light coming through the Kimball. And the other analogy I made to myself was Paul Strand's photographs, the prints made by himself, if you've ever seen them in a museum, or if you're incredibly lucky, in an archive where you can hold them in your hands, compared to those exact same photographs reproduced in an expensive art book, but still reproduced in the printing that is a book form. That's the difference between the Kimball in the daytime and the Kimball at night. And so what was good for me, and this is never going to end up in the book. I mean, there's no way these sentences are going to mean something in a book about Louis Kahn, but they helped me clarify to myself the experience I was getting of seeing this museum and with its light and without its light. Mm. That was a very long answer to a short question, but it was just to give you time to come up with other questions, please. Yeah, come up.
Hi, thanks for being here. As a child, I hated to read those Little House on the Prairie books. I thought were boring, a bunch of sissies, too much nature, and it really turned me off of reading. And I have to say, I'm a writer and editor now, the book that tipped me toward reading, seeing it as pleasure, I'm mortified to say, is a book called Up and Down with the Rolling Stones, which I read in, I'd say, junior high school, and it's a memoir by Keith Richards' drug supplier. So I'm not putting this forth as a defense of this book. I'm sure I'd love the Little House books now, but it started me thinking, is it better to read garbage than to read nothing? And that's the direction I think I was heading in. And now as a parent of a teenager and a 4-year-old as well, I'm kind of running the same conversation in my head. Is it better to read garbage than to read nothing? And I know you're both parents, I believe, and do you have any thoughts on that, especially in terms of the younger generation?
I'll do first if you want. One person's garbage is another person's, fun, pleasurable reading. So, and nobody can say what garbage is. I mean, for myself, it's important at a certain point, not when I was a child. When I was a child, it was just important to consume. And when I was a teenager, I went off all good literature, you might want to say, and read science fiction solid for 4 years. Age 12 to age 16, nothing but science fiction. I don't think that hurt me at all. I think it gave me a little break from the other kind of reading, and it got me interested in plot in a certain way and in imagination in a certain way. And it would have been terrible if someone had stepped in and said, no, you need to read these 3 cantos of the Divine Comedy every night. With my son, he always says, and he says he tells his friends, he's 28 now, but he says one of the chief things about his childhood was that nothing was censored in any way. His reading was not censored, his movie watching was not censored. He was allowed to pick and choose whatever he wanted culturally, which he thinks was incredibly valuable. Now my husband and I look at each other and think, geez, did we make a mistake? But every time he talks out of turn or something, we think, should we have slapped him down a little more? But definitely that was our attitude as parents, and he's a reader too. He's very grateful for having had that. I don't think interference in any kind of reading is a good idea. I can't imagine that there's bad reading.
It's maybe not a coincidence. Between the ages of 12 and 15, I read mainly science fiction. Huh. In my case, I had an invalid mother who was also reading science fiction. And we used to have these cartons she would trade. There was a soldier at the fort she traded with. And we would just indiscriminately gobble these things. And if Wendy is right, an essential part of this whole activity is just toying with the boundary between your actual life and your fantasy life. your actual life and your dreams and daydreams. And it's a combination of freedom, moving between those, and control. And that's a gift I would like to give my grandkids, and I hope I gave my kids, just the gift that there's a way, a very compact way, to be in charge of something a lot like dreaming and a lot like living. And you can just wobble and experiment and practice understanding that pleasure, and that practice then can be applied to all sorts of things. And before science fiction, I can remember in one of those weekly reader polls, what's your favorite book? I read the Alice books over and over again, sort of like your sister with Jane Austen, when I was maybe 9. And I can remember in this 3rd grade, what is your favorite book? And I wrote down Alice in Wonderland, and the teacher humiliated me by probably kindly saying, "Oh, Robert, I'm so surprised you chose a girl's book." So I've shared that trauma now.
He's never gotten over it.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Wonderful question.
Yeah. And speaking of Keith Richards, I haven't read it, but everyone I know who's read the book by him says it's terrific. Yeah.
You didn't read it alone, though.
You didn't? Oh.
I'll try to articulate this. So I've never been a big reader, but lately I've been reading more. And one thing that I've found tremendously helpful for me to broaden my perspective is being in a book group and actually talking about a book and hearing other people's perspectives, particularly with fiction, because there's so many nuances in there that I'm an engineer in real life, so I'm much more literal. So I think that being in a book group and having people to talk with about a book has been very helpful to open my mind. And I'm wondering how you feel about that, or how important that sort of being able to talk about the same book with other people is.
Well, first of all, when my publishers asked me how they should describe this book on the book jacket, I said, well, I think of it as a book group in a box. You know, I mean, say you live out in the middle of nowhere and you don't have anybody that you can be in a book group with. There I am having a conversation with you and suggesting books, strewing ideas by the wayside, but also bringing opinions about them. It's supposed to be like being in a book group, sort of one-on-one. I may have been in a book group and forgotten about it, but I have no conscious memory of ever being in a real book group. But I have a friend who I've known since college, and whenever one of us finds something that we really like, we tell the other about it. I live in California most of the time, and he lives in New York, but we get on the phone and, you know, oh, have you read the Jhumpa Lahiri story in the New Yorker? And then the whole Jhumpa Lahiri collection. Or he just told me the other night, Read the Apartment is something that was just reviewed in the fall, and he just had read it, and he thought it was good. He told me why I might not like it, but he thought it was worth reading. And then he asked, was I going to read the Donna Tartt Goldfinch? And I said I already had. I had problems with it, but I wasn't going to tell him until he was done. So we have our own little book group, and we talk about books every week. And I mean, we talk more often than once a week, but at least once a week we talk about books. And I once said to him, I don't understand why people need to be in book groups. All they need is to have another friend to read with. Yeah, okay. But you do need that. You need a conversation. Yeah.
Hi. I like to read a book since I'm a little girl. I remember my birthday present is since I was in elementary school, is every birthday my mother will give me the present as I go to bookstore to pick whatever book you want. Mm-hmm. That's my every birthday present. But my daughter turns out totally opposite of me. She didn't like to read at all. I mean, unless it's necessary for the school requirement or anything like that. So I discussed with her about this. I said, my pleasure out of reading the book, basically two things. One is like I love to see how clever the author to use the words, to play with the words, come out with a very interesting sentence. That's the one thing. The second thing is to
to know the story, other people's life and plots, those type, to just want to follow up what's the end is coming up. But she kind of like, everybody thinks she's very intelligent. She kind of like, for the second part, she kind of like she already knew everything about life. She doesn't need to know everybody else's life.
How old is
she?
she?
Doesn't care. She's 30 now. She is an architect, she is a dancer, she is a rock climber, she does all sorts of things. Everybody thinks she is intelligent. But then she said she is already knew other people's life. She doesn't need to know. The second thing is she doesn't have a interest about the words, how people play with words. So my question for you is, how do you evaluate a person that she is intelligent for everything else but doesn't read a book basically in her life? Do you think that this kind of life is missing something or intellectually? Or if anybody can live a life without reading book, that many books, or reading very few books, still have a very rich life. And
Well, certainly you can have a rich
lot
life.
of serious pressure from other things.
Yes, of course. And also, I would say, I don't know which Chinese official that was when asked, a 20th century Chinese official when asked what he thought of the French Revolution, he said, too early to tell. So I say, if your daughter is only 30, too early to tell what's going to happen with her and books. I have another friend who, I would say he was a lawyer, and he was also a journalist, but he never read for pleasure, never, until he was about 50. And then he started reading for pleasure, and he reads a lot now. I mean, he doesn't read fast, he doesn't read many books, but he almost always has a book that he's reading these days. So it's like classical music. Have you ever noticed you go to a concert and everybody's old? Because you don't need that until you get older, and then somehow you need it hugely. And I think that can happen with reading too, but I wouldn't worry about it. If she says her life is full, probably her life is full, and she doesn't need to read the way you did. I mean, that's kind of what I was trying to stress about taking the should out of reading.
Sometimes inadvertently, parental nature closes paths down. I have a lot of writer friends, and for a certain number of them, they're children who don't want anything to do with anything. My kids escaped that through scorn. Your friends are coming over, another poet? So they were happy to read. But I have other friends where, up until some point, often in the 30s, the offspring of the literary people want nothing to do with it. And then they'll say to me, wondering, he was talking about a book with... It can happen. The only suggestion I can make is maybe you should buy your daughter a present of that book by the Richard's drug dealer.
Or Keith
Worked
Richards.
once, could work again.
I think she's fine. And also, this is totally off the subject of reading, but one's children never do exactly what one wants them to. That's the nature of children and parents. You have certain ideas about what makes a good life, and they have their own ideas. And we did it to our parents and all the way back, and that's going to happen.
She may be enjoying presenting you with this question and these assertions, and then at some point that pleasure will wear out.
Did someone stand up to ask a question or just to stand up? Go ahead.
I will ask another question, and that is about the new forms of entertainment and mental engagement that could perhaps substitute for reading in the 21st century. Video games, you mentioned them, and these virtual communities which have that kind of gap and that kind of distance that you find in reading. And I wonder, they're very young forms of mental activity, but as you look at them, do you think they will develop or can add that richness to mental life that reading does I mean, since you both have children or grandchildren who might be participants, I
Well-
wonder what your assessment is.
Okay, so first of all, I am not a sociologist and I don't think sociologically, so I have to say that my answer will be just like this book, my personal opinion, and it won't have any weight as what's really going to happen in the world. I'm one of those people that kind of hopes Twitter's just going to go away. If I ignore it, it will disappear. I have nothing against the electronic things that have become instruments in my life, an iPad, an iPhone, email, digital publishing, all of these things I use all the time, every day. But that's like saying, you know, has a car or the movable type altered my intellectual sense? Well, no, not in a way that I'm aware of. They're just instruments that I use. So I'm happy with the side of technology that is instrumental. In terms of video games and Angry Birds substituting for books, I'm horrified at the idea that that could happen. But I just have to say to myself, you know, again, I read Henry James's letters from the beginning of the 20th century, and he thought the world was falling apart, and everybody was an idiot, and nobody could read anything seriously anymore or write anything seriously anymore. And that's what I think is the high point, the early 20th century. So it's all relative, and I also have some faith that there is such a thing as a continuous kind of human nature. I mean, if I can read Homer and the Greek tragedians and understand what's going on there in characters that were made up more than 2,000 years ago, then there is some continuous thing in people, and that continuous thing will demand whatever it is that I get out of reading. They may not demand it in bound books. We don't read scrolls anymore, but I can't help feeling that literature, as I value it, will continue.
I have experimented with these things. There's a tremendous amount of visual imagination in video games. It's very impressive. And in the experimenting I've done, the narrative imagination, certainly not the verbal imagination, has not begun. But you know, people score in the theater for a long time before the theater blooms. So it doesn't, to me, at all impossible that a great imagination, terrific imagination, could take this thing that now, you know, the movies had to evolve.
Right.
So
Or The Wire was the first great TV.
So far, the visual, it all seems very conventional, very much in one vein, over and over again, the same, very artful, violent creatures and warriors. There's probably more. Eventually, there will be more. It's, as you said, it's in its infancy. I don't see any reason to scorn the idea that it may flourish and have the same kind of intelligence, imagination, scope as writing does. Nothing was more rejected as low, base, and probably harmful as the novel.
Yeah.
The novel was completely scorned, then it quickly became the epitome of art. So I wouldn't dismiss it. I'm enough like Wendy to be glad that I'll be dead when this happens. I have that comfort, I won't have to think about it. In the experimenting I've done with the virtual life, you know, I wrote an early text adventure, so I have tangentially, very slightly related to this world. From what I've seen of the virtual lives, it still is pretty stupid. But after all, a novel is virtual life, so who's to say?
A question.
Thanks for your reflections. I'm not sure I read anymore. I mean, I read in bits and snatches, and I read online and short things. So I was just sort of randomly reminiscing about some of the books that I remember having an impact on me. And Philosophical Investigations by Dickinson introduced me to notions of language and meaning that I had never encountered before. The Sound and Fury by William Faulkner. I encountered a nonsensical voice that took me a long time to penetrate and figure out what in the heck is being said here. And then maybe the final one would be Into the Blue by John Krakauer, which transported me to a place and to a series of events that a place on earth that I'll never have access to. So anyway, I just wondered if you both might share 2 or 3 poems or books that blew your minds and sort of inverted your worlds.
Yeah.
Huh. It's very hard to narrow down to 2 or 3. I narrowed down to 100 at the end of this book, and it was really painful, and I kept doing substitutions. But I guess if I think back of books that made that kind of impact on me, Absalom is one of them, another Faulkner novel.
Much better book than Sound and the Fury.
Well, both are great, but Absalom is truly great. And I just reread it within the last year and a half or so, and it was better than ever. But of course had changed, as everything does. Well, something by Henry James, but I keep changing my mind on which one. Whichever one I've just read, that is the great Henry James novel. I read The Tragic Muse, I think, okay, that's the great one. I read Portrait of a Lady, I think that's the great one. I read The Golden Bowl, I think that's the great one. So something by Henry James would be in my list of 3. And to match the philosophical investigations, I would say some brief paragraphs in the writing of David Hume. He made a big difference to me at a very important phase of my life. In my early 20s, I read some of him and I thought, okay, this is a strenuous, rational, sensible, but aesthetically connected, sensual view of the world that I really can connect with. There's a philosopher out there who does the kind of philosophy that matters to me. And I've kind of carried that with me, and I believe that that's still true. So those would be my 3.
I've already mentioned the Alice books. I do think the Benji sections of Sound and the Fury are great, but as a book as a whole, I think it's inferior to Absalom. It's inferior to my favorite, The Hamlet. I love The Hamlet by William Faulkner. The Alice books, the collected poems of William Butler Yeats with Sailing to Byzantium at the head of it. The sociological works of the late Edgar Friedenberg. Edgar Friedenberg wrote a book called The Dignity of Youth and Other Atavisms. He also wrote one called Coming of Age in America. I don't read much social science. I often put it down. There's some profound truth about American society, and especially about youth, teenagers, that he just nails very, very precisely. And to tease Wendy, just to start a fight so that whenever we're finished, Wendy and I can argue a lot. Ulysses by James Joyce.
Which I attack in the book.
I read it, I pick it up and read it as though it were a book of poems. And I'll add 2 translations. The E.V. Rue Odyssey. It's prose, he turns it into a novel, and to me it's irresistible. I do reread it every so often. Rue, R-I-E-U. And I'm currently rereading Alexander Pope's Iliad. It's so beautiful, great introduction by translation. It's gorgeous verse, incredibly noble, and what he does with those couplets is just superb, just great.
The fact that we're all seizing on Faulkner, I suppose it's because we're American, but I mean, he is really a great American writer, and he did so much. And it reminds me of when I was in my 20s, and I had a little business with my friend Catherine, who's the person that wanted to leave the dinner party and go home and read the Mayas. Anyway, she and I received a job in our little consulting business that was to make the bas-relief, as they pretentiously called it, for the Barnes & Noble store that was going to be built on Fifth Avenue in the late 1970s. And what it was supposed to be was 50 great literary characters, 50 great literary titles, 50 great literary places, and I forget what 50 great authors. And we were going to be paid to do this. We were going to sit down and make this list between the 2 of us and send it into Barnes & Noble, with whom somebody had made a connection for us, and they were going to pay us a couple $100, and we were thrilled. But we sat there and we fought about how many Faulkners there could be. No, you can't have 5 Faulkners out of 50, and then we would pair each other down. But that was the sticking point, I remember. Faulkner, he had more than Shakespeare.
Gabriel Garcia Marquez, whose 100 Years of Solitude could be on my list, he says the best novel ever written about South America is The Hamlet by William Faulkner. I was delighted to read that because I think it is the best novel ever written about the New Jersey Shore.
But I would like to add Nostromo.
Another wonderful novel about lower middle class characters on the New Jersey Shore is Ulysses by James Joyce.
Any more questions? Oh, here, yeah.
I think you've already answered this, but I'd like to make it a little more specific. 30 years ago, I commuted on the Red Line to Boston every day, and almost everybody sat there with a book in their lap. Tonight, I came here, and everybody sat there texting. Is there really any hope for the next generation?
Let me just say that not all the people that are holding their iPhones in their hand are texting, because I use my iPhone to read when I'm commuting. Since it's small enough, I don't have to carry a big thing around. So some of them might be reading. But also, this is a regional difference. I've noticed, I go back and forth between New York and California. On the California public transit, BART, nobody is reading a book. A few people might be reading a newspaper, and everybody else is reading their phones. But on the New York subways, people are still reading books, quite a few real books. And so I don't know what that means. And I don't think, art forms go underground for a while, and then they come out again. And I have structured my whole life around literature and print. And I used to make a joke that I hoped, in publishing the Threepenny Review, I hoped that I died before print did, and I thought it was a joke, but I'm not sure it's a joke anymore. We're running neck and neck now. So, you have to kind of get over your sense that the forms that you knew and were attached to are the only possible forms something can take. There's a lot wrong with the world else than the fact that people are texting on the subway, and there's a lot good that's happened too. If you think about the, we have a black president in the White House, we have far longer lives medically than we did 100 years ago. Things, if you just watch TV from the 1950s, you'll be appalled at things that it was possible to say about women, about people of other races, about people of other classes on TV in the 1950s. All that has improved in this country. Things are getting better in a certain way, even as they're also very obviously getting worse. So I think things are cyclical or on a spectrum. I don't think the world's going to hell in a handbasket. I just think it's the nature of life to miss the things that you had in your youth. When I come back to Cambridge, I always feel nostalgic because I went to Harvard. I did not have a nice time at Harvard. I do not like Harvard, but what I miss is my youth. I miss that time, that's all. That's what harks us backward. Do you want to answer?
I have a friend who has two dyslexic sons. They like to read, and they have to read on a phone. The small screen makes it much more possible for them to read, so we can have the wishful thought that those people you see on the train, some of them, as Wendy says, are reading. I can't resist telling an irrelevant story that I love about the New York subway. Author is on the subway, and he sees a guy reading his book. And he holds back for a few stops. Finally, he can't resist, and he says, that book you're reading, huh? I wrote that book. Maybe it's apocryphal, but the guy says, so what? This is New York.
Okay, well, thank you, Wendy Lesser.